Aloha. Welcome to Light Drama Action. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. And let's get to the content for today. Peace.
Listener discretion is strongly advised. And remember, all individuals mentioned in this video, including Mr. Combs, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. You can catch up on all the daily trial summaries in the videos tab of this channel. In a packed Manhattan courtroom, the high-stakes trial of music mogul Sean Diddy Combs reached a breathtaking climax as attorneys delivered their closing arguments. After 7 weeks of explosive testimony, 34 witnesses, and thousands of pieces of evidence, both sides made their last fervent appeals to the jury. On one side, Combs' defense painted the hip-hop icon not as a criminal kingpin, but as a flawed lover ensnared in consensual adult decadence. On the other, federal prosecutors thundered that Combs ran a predatory enterprise where no was never an option and urged jurors to hold him accountable at long last. Prosecutors say he abused, threatened, and coerced women as part of a persistent pattern of sexual exploitation enabled by his business empire. The blockbuster indictment, unsealed in September 2024, accuses Combs of leading a criminal enterprise since 2008 that engaged in sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. If convicted on all counts, Combs could face up to life in prison. A stunning fall from grace for the man once known to millions as Puff Daddy and revered as a cultural icon. This trial itself likely wouldn't exist if not for Combs' former girlfriend, singer Cassandra Ventura, who filed a civil suit against him in November 2023, alleging years of brutal abuse, sex trafficking, and rape. That lawsuit was settled in just 1 day, with Ventura testifying she received $20 million as the price of peace, but it sparked a federal investigation that led to Combs' arrest and indictment. Combs has pleaded not guilty and maintains that all sexual activities in his relationships were consensual, not coercive. Indeed, as his defense attorneys stress, he admits to domestic violence but vehemently denies any organized scheme of trafficking. The tension in the courtroom was palpable on this final day. 6 of Combs' 7 children sat in the gallery behind him alongside his mother, quietly radiating support. As defense attorney Mark Agnifilo began his marathon closing argument, Combs leaned forward at the defense table, hanging on every word. Judge Arun Subramanian watched intently, prepared to rein in any theatrics that crossed legal bounds. The jurors, 12 men and women, observed with grave focus, aware that by Monday they will decide whether to return Combs to his family or brand him a felon. Mark Agnifilo, a seasoned trial attorney, opened the defense's summation by invoking a tale of 2 trials. There's the trial as told by the evidence, the witnesses, the text, the videos, he said, pacing before the jury box. And then there's the trial as told by the prosecutors, the exaggerated trial, the false trial. That is not the real trial, he declared, his voice dripping with skepticism. According to Agnifilo, what the actual evidence showed was not a crime syndicate at all, but a private life of unconventional, consensual indulgences. Call it a swinger's lifestyle, he suggested, between Combs and women who willingly participated. The government, he argued, had spun a lurid fiction to fit a narrative of sex trafficking, when in reality this was their private sex life, defined by consent, not coercion. To drive home that point, Agnifilo spent considerable time recounting the tumultuous romance between Combs and Cassie Ventura, whom he dated from her early 20s until 2018. "We own the domestic violence," he stated plainly, an extraordinary admission that the jury already knew to be true from an infamous hotel surveillance video of Combs attacking Ventura in 2016. Agnifilo did not sugarcoat Combs' propensity for violence in his intimate relationships. Instead, he conceded it and insisted it was not the issue on trial. Cassie said it herself. The issue for her was the domestic violence, he noted, referencing Ventura's own public statements that her main pain was carrying the shame of Combs' abuse. The defense's position was that Combs' abusive outbursts were real, but personal, not part of any criminal conspiracy to traffic. passionate, if toxic, love story rather than a captive nightmare. Ventura was no helpless victim, he implied, but a strong-willed partner who gave as good as she got. Cassie's no joke, and that's why he loved her. She matched him, Agnifilo said, describing their bond as a great modern love story. In his telling, Ventura was free to leave at any time and indeed did leave multiple times, but chose to return out of genuine love and the magnetic pull of Combs' world. She was always free to leave. She chose to stay because she was in love with him, he asserted. When Ventura finally ended the relationship for good in 2018 and walked away, Combs felt no pushback, Agnifilo argued, noting that Combs let her go without attempting to hunt her down or retaliate. All of this, the defense suggested, was inconsistent with the portrait of a sex trafficking prisoner prosecutors had drawn. What about the most salacious aspect of the case, those notorious freak-offs? Ventura testified that Combs routinely forced her into drug-fueled marathon sex sessions with male strangers, which Combs often filmed under threat of violence or retaliation. He claimed Ventura willingly participated in these elaborate encounters, even if they might not have been her idea initially. The evidence is overwhelming that Ventura wanted to participate, he argued, pointing to sexually explicit text messages Ventura herself sent that suggested enthusiasm or at least openness to Combs' fantasies. Agnifilo asked the jurors to put themselves in the shoes of a couple exploring edgy desires. If one partner likes something extreme and the other doesn't really, but they do it to make the first partner happy, where does that land on the spectrum of consent? He mused. He suggested that Ventura may have gone along with Combs' request out of love and a willingness to indulge his kinks, even if she might later regret it. She's a woman who actually likes sex. Good for her. She's beautiful. She should, Agnifilo exclaimed, in a blunt appeal not to shame Ventura for any enjoyment she derived. He emphasized that Ventura herself never contemporaneously complained or told Combs no about the freak-offs. To illustrate the atmosphere of those nights, Agnifilo described one sex tape shown in evidence. The hotel rooms are beautiful. The music is nice. Cassie is eating watermelon, he noted casually. Far from a scene of terror, the video showed a friendly, easygoing vibe, he claimed. There's a real, genuine intimacy and everyone is smiling, laughing, forget the sex part, he said. In Agnifilo's view, these were consensual adult escapades, perhaps unusual to outsiders, but hardly crimes. He's not the only man in America making homemade porn, he quipped, adding that paying people to participate in sexual situations is common in the world of adult entertainment. The defense narrative extended beyond Ventura, also spotlighted Jane, another of Combs' ex-girlfriends who testified under a pseudonym about a relationship from 2021 to 2024 that mirrored Ventura's claims. Jane too described being dragged into hotel nights featuring hired male entertainers, with Combs allegedly orchestrating the encounters and sometimes turning violent. Agnifilo conceded that Combs battered Jane during a June 18, 2024 fight. There's obvious physical contact, he admitted, but he argued that Jane herself provoked that altercation and possibly even staged it for ulterior motives. According to Jane's testimony, that night began with a jealous argument. She was upset over social media posts of Combs with another woman. It escalated when Jane suddenly slammed Combs' head into a kitchen counter in rage and hurling insults. Jane said Combs then flew into a fury, kicking down a bedroom door, dragging her outside and punching and slapping her repeatedly. Photos after the incident showed Jane's face bruised and swollen, but Agnifilo urged jurors to scrutinize her account skeptically. Her story truly makes no sense. The whole night makes no sense, he argued, raising an eyebrow. Why would Jane, who had never been physically violent with Combs before, suddenly attack him so aggressively? The defense floated a theory. Jane knew federal investigators were circling Combs by mid-2024, and she knows there's an investigation, Agnifilo noted. Did she prompt this? Did she want this to happen? He asked the jury pointedly. In other words, was Jane setting Combs up, goading him into a rage to collect evidence against him? Agnifilo posited that's the only way the unprovoked extreme violence makes sense. He also minimized the fight's severity, claiming Combs might have struck Jane only twice, given the 2 bruises on her face, despite her dramatic testimony of a prolonged beating. While nothing excuses Combs' violence, Agnifilo argued, it wasn't part of a trafficking scheme at all, just an ugly lover's quarrel that Jane later opportunistically weaponized. Importantly, he emphasized, Jane never went to the police after this incident. Instead, she continued to interact with Combs and even by her own admission, arranged another hotel night with a male escort in the months afterward. If Jane truly felt trafficked or traumatized, why would she keep participating? In Agnifilo's telling, Jane's continued involvement was explained not by fear, but by personal gain. He portrayed Jane as a socialite who moved in that sort of strata of celebrities comfortably, noting she had a child with another famous musician and enjoyed the perks of dating Combs, lavish trips, luxury gifts, public notoriety. She was focused on what she was getting out of it that the world can see, he said, referencing the exotic vacations Jane proudly posted on Instagram. Yes, Jane loved Combs in her way, the defense conceded, but she also loved the lifestyle. Crucially, the defense countered the prosecution's argument that Combs financially trapped Jane by paying her rent. In 2023, Combs had signed a so-called love contract with Jane, agreeing to provide a $10,000 per month allowance for her Los Angeles home. Prosecutors alleged this was leverage. Jane feared losing her home if she disobeyed Combs, thus feeling coerced to comply with his sexual demands. Agnifilo vehemently disagreed. The house is a gesture of kindness, of decency, of niceness, like he told the jury, arguing Combs was merely taking care of a woman and her young child after the child's own father dropped the ball on support. In fact, he noted, Combs kept paying Jane's rent even after their breakup and even now continues to cover it, though she testified against him. They made a deal and he kept it. Good for him, Agnifilo said, his tone implying this generosity hardly fits the portrait of a vindictive trafficker. By 2024, the lawyer argued, Jane was staying with Combs out of choice and convenience, not fear. That's all you need to know, he told the jury about Jane's participation in the sexual encounters. She regrets it, she resents him for it. That came later. But at the time, Jane was a willing partner, not a victim. The defense also sought to undercut the credibility of other accusers in the case. One particularly emotional witness, a former Combs personal assistant who testified under the pseudonym Mia, had described being by Combs and forced to perform oral sex on him during her employment. Mia's tearful account, including physically shrinking on the stand when recalling the assaults, clearly moved the courtroom. But Agnifilo told jurors Mia was putting on a false persona. He argued that video evidence and Mia's own past behavior contradicted her claims of terror. In one birthday video shown at trial, Mia is seen laughing and bubbly, presenting Combs with a heartfelt scrapbook she made for his 45th birthday, far from someone cowering in fear. If Combs had truly violated her, why would she display such warmth? The defense suggested Mia fabricated her allegations years later, possibly for attention, or as a misguided attempt to join the chorus of other accusers. Even theorized that any sexual contact between Combs and Mia had been consensual. He pointed to a text message in which Combs threatened to tell Cassie Ventura about what happened with Mia, an exchange implying a secret consensual dalliance that both wanted to hide from Cassie. Why would Combs tease telling Cassie, the defense asked, if he had violently assaulted Mia against her will? That wouldn't be something Mia would fear Cassie discovering, unless Mia had willingly slept with Combs. In the defense's view, the simplest explanation was that Combs and Mia had an affair during her employment, one she later rebranded as assault. Agnifilo urged jurors to recall the smiling, real Mia from the video, not the sobbing figure on the witness stand, when judging her credibility. The government had woven a narrative of Combs as a puppeteer who ordered henchmen to do his dirty work, kidnapping a confidant who displeased him, firebombing a rival's car, pushing drugs, bribing guards, and tampering with witnesses to cover his tracks. The defense sought to dismantle each of these subplots as unproven or absurd. The 2004 kidnapping of Capricorn Clark, former employee Capricorn Clark, testified that years ago, Combs forced her to undergo a harrowing multi-day interrogation over a missing piece of jewelry complete with lie detector tests and threats of being thrown in a river if she failed. Agnifilo scoffed at calling that a kidnapping. He pointed out that Clark went home each night after the polygraph sessions, escorted by security, only to return the next day. Hardly the behavior of someone held captive. You come to court every day and go home every night. You're about as kidnapped as she was, he joked to the jury, eliciting a few smiles. Yes, the lie detector ordeal was unsettling, Agnifilo allowed, but he argued Combs had nothing to do with it. At the time, Combs was busy starring in a Broadway show, A Raisin in the Sun, and running multiple companies. He couldn't care less about a stolen trinket and wasn't personally managing any polygraph room, the lawyer argued. In short, Clark's tale might reflect poor judgment by overzealous security staff, but not a crime ordered by Combs. The 2011 gunpoint confrontation and Kid Cudi's car bombing, one of the most dramatic stories, came from Clark again. She claimed that in late 2011, Combs showed up at her home with a gun, forced her into his car, and took her along to confront rapper Kid Cudi at Cudi's house, enraged that Cudi had been dating Cassie Ventura on the sly. Combs allegedly broke into Cudi's property. Clark waited outside and later ominously told Ventura he would blow up Kid Cudi's car. Sure enough, Cudi's Porsche was firebombed in his driveway months later. The defense flatly dismissed this as urban legend. Agnifilo argued that Clark's own phone call to Kid that night never mentioned Combs having a gun, something no one would omit if true. Police records from that incident labeled it a mere trespass, with no mention of a firearm. Why? Because, Agnifilo insisted, Combs never wielded one. If Capricorn had said gun that night, Cudi would have remembered. You don't forget gun. It's one of those fear words, he said with a flourish, casting doubt on her credibility. As for the arson, Agnifilo noted that investigators conducted a terrible investigation and never tied it to Combs. No charges were filed. In fact, a partial DNA profile from the crime scene matched a female, not Combs. Agnifilo argued it was ludicrous to think Combs, a man with a reputation for confronting rivals face to face, would take a coward's way out by secretly blowing up someone's car. He's gonna fight him. He's not gonna blow up his car, the attorney said, tapping into Combs' brash persona. Indeed, when Agnifilo suggested to the jury that Combs would have preferred a good old-fashioned fistfight with Kid Cudi instead of a covert bombing, Combs nodded vigorously from the defense table as if to say, exactly. Perhaps the most incriminating evidence against Combs was the security camera footage from the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles, March 2016, which captured Combs violently tackling and kicking Cassie Ventura during an argument. The jury had watched this tape, which Ventura called one of the scariest moments of her life, and also heard that Combs paid a security guard $100,000 in cash to hand over the only copy of the footage. Prosecutors cast that payoff as a brazen bribe and obstruction of justice born of consciousness of guilt. The defense had a different spin. Agnifilo contended Combs' motive was not to dodge police. Ventura never called the cops after all, but to avoid public embarrassment and immediate fallout. He reminded jurors that Ventura did not want law enforcement involved that day. She just wanted to get away from Combs peacefully. Combs, for his part, panicked at the thought of TMZ, the press obtaining the damning tape of him manhandling his celebrity girlfriend in a hotel hallway, so he threw money at the problem to make it disappear. Under California law, Agnifilo argued, paying someone to suppress a video for PR reasons isn't a crime unless it's done to impede an actual investigation. The police were nowhere near the situation, he said. Indeed, Ventura testified that when she fled the hotel suite after the assault, she didn't contact police. She called Combs' staff for help retrieving her belongings. Combs showing up later banging on her apartment door was the only reason LAPD got wind of the incident. Neighbors called 911 for the disturbance. Thus, in the defense's view, the cash for video deal might be unsavory, but it was not an admission of guilt so much as a celebrity worrying about bad publicity. Agnifilo also suggested something was off with the drugs Combs took that day, possibly explaining his outburst. Texts between Combs and Ventura afterwards mentioned that his usual cocktail of drugs had affected him strangely. He was walking around a hotel in the middle of the day in a towel and socks, and what gives? Agnifilo said with a shrug, implying the incident was a drug-addled anomaly, not part of any broader scheme. Prosecutors alleged that part of Combs' racketeering enterprise involved obtaining and distributing large quantities of narcotics to keep his victims pliant. Agnifilo dismissed this outright. There's no doubt he had personal use drugs. He obviously has a drug problem, but there's not a shred of evidence he was selling or sharing drugs as part of a business. Combs did cocaine with his girlfriends, but he wasn't profiting off it or forcing it on anyone beyond the context of mutual partying. The purpose of these businesses in this enterprise had nothing to do with getting him drugs, Agnifilo insisted, noting that while assistants might pick up packages for Combs, that was personal favor, not an organizational drug conspiracy. Finally, Agnifilo attacked the very heart of the case, the idea that Combs led a criminal enterprise. For the racketeering conspiracy charge to stick, jurors must believe Combs and others worked together in a coordinated way to commit crimes. But, Agnifilo argued, Combs stood alone in the indictment. No alleged co-conspirators were charged alongside him, and there was a gaping lack of evidence that anyone on his staff thought they were part of a crime ring. This is his personal life. It's not about an enterprise, he said plainly. There's no witness to say that there is an enterprise. It's not about racketeering activity. None of the insiders, not Combs' longtime security chief, Roger D. Rock Mills, not his personal assistants, not his studio executives, took the stand to corroborate a conspiracy. In fact, several former employees testified positively about Combs. Agnifilo reminded jurors that witnesses who worked in Combs' circle described him as a demanding but generous boss who championed diversity and loyalty. He is a self-made, successful black entrepreneur, Agnifilo said, praising Combs' business achievements and even calling him a pioneer of corporate diversity decades before it was fashionable. Yes, some employees, like D-Rock and Chief of Staff Christina Coram, occasionally helped Combs handle personal issues, even covering for his misdeeds, but that did not make them racketeers. They were playing both sides, befriending Cassie Ventura and others to keep Combs happy, but that's office politics, not organized crime. One by one, Agnifilo dismantled the prosecution's specific claims of enterprise acts. On the allegation of interstate prostitution, for instance, the high-end escort service Combs frequently used to book male companions. If you're paying for time and two adults meet and they decide to have sex, it's not illegal, he reasoned. Combs would have reasonably assumed that a long-running business like Cowboys 4 Angels was operating legally, he said, since there are all these companies around the world doing this. By paying the agency and then tipping the men in cash, Combs could believe he was within the law, merely compensating companions for their time. Agnifilo quoted one escort who testified that he didn't consider himself a prostitute and wasn't hired explicitly to have sex, supporting the idea that lines were blurred. There's no actual evidence of prostitution, Agnifilo argued, noting no witness introduced himself saying, "Hi, I'm a male prostitute." In Combs' mind, Agnifilo maintained hiring sexy models to hang out and not a crime. The defense contended Combs never paid for sex per se. He paid for fun evenings that sometimes became sexual. Another courtroom sketch shows members of Combs' family, including several of his children and his mother, seated in the gallery during closing arguments. Their presence was a poignant reminder of what hangs in the balance as the jury deliberates not just Combs' fate, but the future of a family. As the afternoon wore on, Agnifilo's voice rose with righteous indignation. He accused the government of stretching the law and the truth just to take down a celebrity. He pointed to the timing that prosecutors jumped on Combs only after Cassie Ventura's bombshell lawsuit went public in late 2023. "I think the evidence shows the government targeted Sean Combs. The Cassie lawsuit comes out and these guys wanted to make a case," Agnifilo proclaimed, venturing into a risky argument. Indeed, he openly questioned the prosecutors' motives, suggesting they wouldn't have pursued Combs without the media pressure from Ventura's allegations. This prompted Judge Subramanian to swiftly intervene. Such comments tread close to improper jury nullification territory. The judge sternly instructed jurors to disregard any insinuations about why the government chose to investigate or indict. The government's decision to prosecute is none of your concern, he admonished, making sure Agnifalo's jab wouldn't taint deliberations. Unfazed, Agnifalo nodded and continued, albeit on a tighter leash. After nearly 4.5 hours, Agnifalo reached his crescendo. In a plea that was part legal reasoning, part emotional appeal, he implored the jury to do the right thing and acquit on all counts. He reminded them of the high burden of proof and the holes he had worked to poke in the state's case. At what point do you stop trusting the government? He asked, echoing a refrain that perhaps the prosecutors had overreached. Ultimately, he said, the case came down to courage. It will take courage to acquit him, but I'm asking you to have that courage. Pointing at his client, Agnifilo spoke with conviction. He is not a racketeer. He's none of these things. He sits there innocent. Combs, who had been scribbling occasional notes and often fidgeting nervously with his hands, locked eyes with the jurors as his lawyer delivered the final words. Return him to his family who have been waiting for him. With that, the defense rested their case in chief, not with a whimper, but a battle cry. Observers noted that Combs appeared teary-eyed as he whispered thanks to his legal team. Behind him, his children exchanged anxious looks and squeezed their grandmother's hand. One of Combs' twin 16-year-old daughters gently rubbed her nana's back. The day's intensity weighed on the family. They had sat stoically through descriptions of gruesome abuse, but as Agnifalo gave voice to the possibility of acquittal, emotion finally seeped through. Even outside the courtroom, the spectacle continued. In a show of support, Combs' 27-year-old son, Christian King Combs, had that very day released a new song pointedly titled Diddy Free. The track, a collaboration with Kanye West, features a chorus defiantly chanting, "Ain't going sleep till we see Diddy free." It was a surreal collision of pop culture and justice. As a federal jury deliberates his fate, Combs' family is literally broadcasting their confidence in his freedom through music. When the jurors returned from break, it was the prosecution's turn to answer the defense's saga with a final rebuttal. Assistant U.S. Attorney Maureen Comey, composed, incisive, and visibly impassioned, rose to deliver the last words the jury would hear before retiring to decide Sean Combs' destiny. The prosecution's rebuttal, "Find him guilty." Maureen Comey did not mince words. Standing before the jury, the prosecutor's tone was steely and direct, a counterpoint to the defense's emotive plea. She accused the defense of spending a whole lot of energy trying to blame his victims and the government for his lies, his threats, and his violence. Those were nothing but excuses for the inexcusable, Comey said, urging jurors not to be swayed by what she characterized as the defense's distortion of the facts. Addressing Agnifalo's portrayal of a love story and a swinger's paradise, Comey's voice brimmed with incredulity. "The defense wanted you to believe Cassie and Jane wanted that," she said, practically spitting out the word "that." She gestured to the evidence photos and testimony describing the freak-offs, dim hotel suites, drawn shades, the air heavy with marijuana, and the scent of baby oil. "It defies logic to think anyone wanted this," as Comey argued. "What we're talking about is being in a dark hotel room, awake for days, covered in oil, often with a UTI, in 8-inch heels, with your pelvic area sore, having unprotected sex for hours with stranger after stranger." As jurors shifted in their seats at the graphic description, Comey drove the point home. "That's ridiculous on its face. No woman would endure such degrading marathons for mere kicks or luxury handbags," she implied. These encounters happened because Combs wanted them and wouldn't take no, not because his girlfriends truly enjoyed it. Comey methodically dismantled the defense's core arguments one by one. Consent? Hardly. She reminded the jury of the consistent patterns of coercion described by Ventura and Jane, how Combs isolated them, beat them, controlled their finances and careers, and wielded fear to get compliance. The defense's own admission of domestic violence was key. "Being a domestic abuser is not a defense to sex trafficking," Comey said pointedly, echoing a line from her earlier closing. "If part of the abuse is making your partner participate in a commercial sex act, you're guilty of sex trafficking. All those instances of punching, kicking, and terrorizing, they weren't unrelated lovers' quarrels, Comey argued, but the mechanism by which Combs bent these women to his will. There's no separating the violence from the sex, she said. The jury had seen photos of Cassidy Ventura's bruised face and busted lip after one freak-off interrupted by Combs' rage. They'd heard how Jane cowered in a closet after being beaten, only to be dragged out and made to sexually serve as an escort as punishment. These were textbook examples of sex trafficking, Comey insisted, where physical force and psychological coercion were used to obtain commercial sex acts. She seized on the June 2024 incident with Jane, the one Agnifilo suggested was a setup, calling it the most clear-cut example of Combs' trafficking scheme coming to fruition. Turning to the notion that Ventura and Jane benefited from Combs' wealth, Comey acknowledged an ugly truth. Yes, he bought them things. Yes, he bankrolled lavish lifestyles, penthouses, trips, designer clothes. But rather than proving their consent, those gifts were all tools the defendant used to control Cassie and Jane, Comey said. It trapped them, she added simply. The prosecutor described what modern psychology terms a trauma bond. Ventura and Jane would try to leave, but Combs lured them back with apologies, money, and gestures of care, only to hurt them again. A cycle of dependency that is hard to break. The defense had called Combs' paying Jane's rent a gesture of niceness. Comey flipped that on its head. That's coercion when she was afraid she'd lose her home if she didn't do as he wanted, Comey argued, reminding jurors that by 2023, Jane felt obligated to perform in freak-offs precisely because of that financial tether. As for Ventura, Comey noted that while she did receive a large settlement and was hailed as a survivor in the press, she risked it all by testifying at this trial. She already got paid and had the media on her side, Comey said. Why would she perjure herself now? Indeed, Ventura's $20 million settlement came with no obligation to participate in a criminal case. And potentially, she jeopardized that deal by speaking out under oath. The only reason Ventura was here, Comey asserted, was because it was the right thing to do. Far from being money hungry, Ventura had everything to lose and little to gain by taking the stand in a federal trial, a point the prosecutor used to bolster Ventura's credibility. Comey similarly defended the other accuser's motives. One pseudonymous witness, Mia, had settled her own dispute with Combs years ago and expected no compensation for testifying. Mia, in fact, requested anonymity out of fear and embarrassment. Hardly the behavior of someone seeking fame, Comey observed, and Jane notably has not sued Combs at all. In fact, Jane does have a financial incentive, but it's to lie in favor of the defendant, Comey argued, in a striking reversal of the defense's claim. Recall that Combs is still paying Jane's rent and even paying for her lawyer. If Jane wanted money above all, it would make more sense for her to protect her benefactor, not betray him. On that last point, Comey zeroed in on evidence of Combs' consciousness of guilt. Agnifilo had portrayed Combs as naively trusting an escort agency and never imagining he was breaking the law. Comey all but laughed at that. She reminded jurors of Combs' text messages introduced at trial, messages where he explicitly told Ventura to vet the male escorts to ensure they weren't undercover cops, and where he directly asked an escort via text if the man was law enforcement. Common sense alone shows you that when the defendant flew those escorts out, it was not for their scintillating conversation, Comey said, archly echoing Agnifilo's earlier flippant phrasing. When he flew those men and paid them, it wasn't for conversation, it was for sex, she stated bluntly. Combs knew perfectly well that what he was doing was illegal, Comey argued, precisely because he took steps to avoid detection by law enforcement. Why worry about undercover cops if you think you're doing nothing wrong? That alone, she suggested, shatters the defense's claim that Combs was ignorant of any criminal aspect. Similarly, Comey revisited the Intercontinental Hotel incident, not to rehash the assault itself, but to hammer the aftermath. The $100,000 payoff and NDA that Combs arranged with security officer Eddie Garcia was deeply telling, she said. The non-disclosure agreement included a clause that Garcia must alert Combs if he received any court order or law enforcement inquiry about video. Of course, the police and an investigation were on Sean Combs' mind, Comey exclaimed. Why else put such a clause in writing, and why did Combs advise Garcia not to make any big purchases with the cash? Because he feared the authorities might notice Garcia suddenly flush with money and trace it back. This is bribery, Comey said bluntly. It was the act of a man who knew he had committed a crime and was desperate to bury the evidence, she argued, underscoring that Combs' enterprise actively engaged in obstruction of justice. Agnifilo had shown texts where Combs' head of security, D. Rock, offered financially to help Mia when she said she was broke, suggesting it was just out of kindness. But Comey pointed to other evidence. Recorded phone calls between Combs and Jane in late 2023 after Ventura's lawsuit, where Combs was heard telling Jane, "I can't be on the phone," repeatedly. Plaintiff's lawyers don't tap phones, the feds do, Comey noted. She argued Combs was clearly fearful of surveillance and was coaching Jane on what to say or not say. Strong evidence that he was attempting to influence a witness's testimony illicitly. In her rebuttal, Maureen Comey systematically brought the focus back to accountability and common sense. Where the defense cast Combs as a man who couldn't even plug in his own phone charger without help, so how could he mastermind a criminal ring? Comey countered that Combs' very need for an entourage proved the existence of an enterprise. Do you really think he didn't need his inner circle to help him get drugs, to kidnap Capricorn Clark, to intimidate people? She reminded jurors that enterprises can have lawful parts. Combs' businesses themselves might be legitimate and still have members who commit unlawful acts. They use some of the money to further the enterprise, she argued, referencing how Combs' wealth was used to pay escorts, bribe security, and fund the lavish trappings that kept victims dependent. His closest staff, the enterprise, in the government's view, were complicit, even if they weren't formally charged. They played both sides with Ventura, Comey said, appearing to comfort her, but ultimately doing Combs' bidding to keep her under his control. The lack of co-defendants, she implied, was irrelevant. The enterprise existed, in fact, if not in the indictment. Finally, Comey addressed the burden of proof for sex trafficking. She highlighted that the jury instructions would make clear, to convict Combs of sex trafficking, the jurors need only find one instance, one freak-off or one hotel night in which Combs used force, fraud, or coercion to obtain a commercial sex act. Just one. They didn't have to sort out every single encounter or draw arbitrary lines, as the defense facetiously suggested. Comey argued the evidence had established dozens of such instances, but even if the jurors believe only one victim's account of only one night, that legally would be enough. And by the same token, convicting on the racketeering count didn't require believing every allegation, just enough of the pattern to show Combs engaged in two or more of the predicate crimes as part of his enterprise. Her rebuttal crescendo came as she quoted directly from Combs' own hubristic statements and confronted the jury with the human cost of his actions. The defendant never thought the women he abused would have the courage to speak out loud what he had done to them, Comey said, her voice resonating with empathy for the accusers. But they did speak. For 20 years, the defendant got away with his crimes. That ends in this courtroom, she vowed, echoing the very words of Combs' indictment and her opening statement. Combs, she reminded them, had dubbed himself Love in recent years as a moniker, but there was no love in what these women endured. The defendant is not a god, Comey stated firmly, indirectly refuting any notion of Combs' celebrity placing him above justice. He is a person, and in this courtroom, he stands equal before the law. Over months of testimony, Comey said, the truth of that equality had been proven. No amount of wealth or fame can shield a predator forever. Overwhelming evidence proves his guilt, she declared, her gaze steady. It is time to hold him accountable, find him guilty. Those last four words hung in the air like a dare, find him guilty. For a moment, the courtroom was silent, but for the scratch of a reporter's pen. Combs shifted slightly in his chair. From across the room, his mother closed her eyes, lips moving in silent prayer. The jurors absorbed Comey's final exhortation without visible reaction, but the weight of the decision ahead of them was unmistakable. Judge Subramanian thanked the attorneys and told the jury that their service was about to enter its most critical phase. He informed them he would deliver the formal jury instructions first thing Monday morning, after which the deliberations would begin. Until then, they were admonished not to discuss the case or consume any media about it. The jurors nodded dutifully. With that, court was adjourned for the weekend. Sean Combs was let out in handcuffs, as he has been each day of this trial. A far cry from the designer suits and swaggering entrances of his heyday. In a brief, poignant moment, Combs glanced back at his family before disappearing through the door. His twin daughters flashed him hopeful smiles and a heart sign with their hands. The weekend would no doubt be a long one for them, filled with anxious hope and fear.